Okay, so the gentleman we've all come to see and hear today, I hope you give him a really big welcome. He's flown over from California, I believe. I'm looking for a nod, indeed California. So we're so grateful to have him here with us today. Many people in Britain may not have heard of Percival Everett until a little while ago when his book, The Trees, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Certainly massive attention ever since, and of course now with Erasure being made into a film, that's again raised his profile and his voice, and what a phenomenal voice it is. If you've read any of his books already, you'll know what a star of a writer he is. And in his 30 years or more of writing, I think he's probably written as many books. So there's plenty more for us all to catch up on, I'm absolutely certain, and I'm so pleased that a lot of it's been republished or published now in the UK. Please put your hands together and give a big Brixton welcome to Percival Everett.
First of all, thank you for being here. I feel like we've already had half our...
This is great. Thank you for having me here at the library. This is wonderful.
I feel like we already had half our discussion upstairs, but one of the things I wanted to ask was, how are you feeling? How does it feel to have this new novel out in the world?
I never know how to answer that, and I'm just glad it's away from me. No, it's great. And the reception, I don't go online, so I don't read reviews. And my publisher lies to me and tells me they're all good, so I'm happy as long as they're happy.
So James, which I spent a good amount of time with over the past few weeks, is a reimagining of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and I wondered if you remember your first encounter with the original text.
Well, I do. It was when I was very young. I read an abridged version of it. I don't know what made it abridged. It was just short enough for a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, and I can't say that I was ever in love with the novel Huck Finn. I read Tom Sawyer before Huck Finn and pretty much hated that. And then I read Huck Finn, and again, the abridged version was an adventure. But Mark Twain sort of marked me. He became a real influence in my sense of humor, my sense of irony. And when I read Life on the Mississippi and Roughing It, 2 nonfiction books. So I was influenced by Twain, but ironically, not so much. Then as a teenager, I read the unabridged version, and as a black teenager in America, reading it obviously was somewhat problematic, or not that I found any fault with the text, but it was difficult because Jim is not fully realized as a person. But it's the first time in American literature where a character pretty much symbolizes that adolescent America moving through its own landscape, dealing with that subject which was and continues to be the most defining feature of the American experience, which is race.
And so I guess all these years later, why this story? What gravitated you towards this? Or towards Jim?
Well, again, it's hardly a romantic answer. I was playing tennis, and I hit the ball just wildly out of the court. And as I watched the ball sail, I thought, I wonder if anyone has written this story from Jim's point of view. And which also explained to me why I hit the ball so poorly. And I went home and I started looking, and it turned out no one had. decided to do it. I didn't know that, and I thought at the time was, why hasn't anyone done this before? And then I realized I hadn't thought of it either. So
I guess once you had decided it, what was the approach to fabulating parts of Jim's story, and where did you want to stick with the original text, and where did you want to diverge?
Well, see, that was the thing. I'd never written something that was based on an extant text. So I immediately realized and decided that I wanted to inhabit that world, but I did not want to inhabit that text. So I had to find a way to divorce myself from Twain's novel. My way of doing that was I read Huck Finn 15 times in a row. I would finish the novel and go right back to the beginning until I was, it was a blur and I hated it and I was sick of it. Around time 5, I really hated this novel and I needed that. And then I closed it after the last reading, and I still have not gone back to it. I haven't looked back at the novel. I doubt I will ever read that novel again. But it allowed me to internalize the stories and the people of that world without having any allegiance to Twain's words.
I think the first thing that I was struck by was not only hearing Jim's voice on the page and having this certain humanity that emerges that wasn't in the original text, but actually how you're externalizing his interiority, that there is a real full scope of emotion, or we're trying to reach towards an emotion that happens across the page. And I wondered, what was that, like the intention there? Was there something in trying to pull his interiority out that meant that you could better render him on the page?
Well, I should probably back up and say, I didn't write this as out of any dissatisfaction with the novel Huck Finn. I didn't write it as a corrective. I flatter myself by thinking I'm in conversation with Twain about this world that he's created. But when he set to work, he was writing a story about an adolescent white boy on the American landscape. I read the novel and I see what's missing, and so I'm writing the part that he was not equipped to write, and that is rendering the voice of an adult black man on the American landscape. So our missions were different. There was no space in the world he was trying to create to do this. It's also a psychic and cultural space that he could not occupy. And so James is a completely different story, really, world, because of the point of view and the fact that children and adults see the world differently.
If, as you say, that Jim is the center of this story, and that actually it's not a corrective measure, as you were writing, how did you decide to give Huck the space that was present in the novel? Like how did you decide how much space you wanted to give him there? And what, did you find there was any sort of incongruence when you were writing Jim's story and finding that Huck was just appearing again and again?
Well, that's a really good question. Why don't you answer that too? Huck is there. Huck is a fixture in Jim's life, and he's rendered as any important character would be rendered. He's not peripheral in the way the Judge Thatcher or some of the other enslaved people are just parts of the world as they move by. He's important, but there's a symbiotic relationship between the two of them. Well, in Huck Finn, Jim is the only positive male role model in the book. Judge Thatcher notwithstanding, because he's off in the wings anyway. And in my novel, Huck is necessary for Jim's movement through the world. James is unsafe moving through the world without a reason to be in a particular place. A black man alone is a runaway slave. He needs Huck. Conversely, Huck is a child in the world, and James cares for him, takes care of him. So they need each other, and in that way, that relationship moves the story along.
There were so many moments where, actually, and that really explains it through. There were so many moments where I was desperate for Jim to dash away Huck on the side of the Mississippi River, and there were, for different reasons, I don't want to spoil anything for anyone, but there were so many different reasons that Jim kept him around, or kept him in orbit, or didn't push him in the way that. There's so much resolve from Jim. There are so many occasions where actually the decisions that he's making, he's standing on the ground and really making those decisions. But when it came to Huck, there was this sort of sense of obligation at times, responsibility at times. And I wondered, again, also, like, did that play into it, as well as this sense of Jim is a runaway slave and he needs Huck to survive?
Well, again, he needs him, but he's there to protect him. And he's there to protect him because he's a decent person. Huck is a child. He's alone, and Jim is a father. So he cannot abandon Huck because it's not in his moral compass to do that. I think when I started working on it, I thought part of my thinking was that I was going to give Jim agency, and as I started, I realized that Jim has agency. I'm not supplying that. What I'm supplying is the story in which Jim finds a way to express his agency in a world that would deny it.
Some of my favourite parts of the novel were the moments where Jim falls asleep and finds himself visited by various thinkers of the then past and present, Voltaire and John Locke, and he has these moments where he is actively trying to ask bigger questions and trying to, I think the thing that each of those moments really came down to was this idea of rights and equality. And there's a moment where you're writing about this idea of arguing for your equality, but not having the grounds to be able to, but the person who you're arguing against doesn't see you as equal. And I wondered, in that sort of dream space, like what were you trying to afford Jim? You're talking about agency, but was it just like the space to imagine and dream these bigger questions and try and work through?
Well, it's also trying to call into to question the Enlightenment philosophers, particularly the Enlightenment thinker Thomas Jefferson. The philosophers surface in conversation with Jim because he can go find their books in the library that he sneaks into and finds literacy and his education. But Jefferson didn't leave any books on philosophy, and so I used them as stand-ins for him. Jefferson being the person who penned the words in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. And it turns out for the Enlightenment, for all of these philosophers, that it was some people are more equal than others. And so Jim is challenging their philosophical belief that there's equality among people. And he's asking, how can you reconcile this with your justification or rationalization for slavery at the same time.
I think in one of the visitations he speaks about this idea of natural liberties. And I'll read the quote where he said, when those liberties are put on societal and cultural pressure, they become civil liberties, and those are contingent on hierarchy and situation. And I wonder what relevance that specific notion had as you were writing for then and also for now.
Again, that's part of the rationalization of mistreatment of other peoples, and I think if I remember, I have to apologize because when I finish a book, I forget it. And people ask me about scenes, thank you very much, and I honestly don't remember it, so I'm having to go back in my head and find this stuff. I think if I'm probably wrong, is that the discussion with Voltaire. Voltaire, when things, he talks about the rights of people and those rights which are inalienable, but then he qualifies it. They become civil rights, and by that, or civic rights, and by that, we're to understand that people earn these rights. And his conception is that, yes, James, we are equal, but you have to understand that we're equal because you have the potential to become equal. You can have these rights, but because of circumstance, just as the sun in your part of the world has made your skin darker, it has so changed you so that you have not achieved the European ideal, but you can get there. And one has to appreciate such kind-hearted advice. But that's what James is responding to when he has these conversations with the enlightenment.
Early on in the novel, James speaks about this idea of situational translation, and throughout, when James is in his own company or when he's with other black people, you hear his own voice come clear and ring true, but when he's among people who aren't, including Huck up to a certain point, there's a sort of colloquiality that's employed. There's a language that is used that is supposed to encourage the sense that black people are inferior to white people for their sake. And I wondered, where did that specific idea of situational translation kind of come to you, and also why did language become such a focal point for the novel? Because I think it's something that runs throughout.
Well, I think everything I write is finally about language. It's at the root of my interest in making art, even any kind of art. What Caleb is referring to is that when the slaves speak to each other, they speak in what we might call, for lack of a better term, standard English. But when any white person shows up, they slip into what they call slave. And they speak this way, this stereotypic way, to satisfy the expectations of the white people around them, because anything else would be dangerous for them. And I didn't come up with this. This is what human beings do. Oppressed, enslaved, imprisoned people always find a way to talk to each other that does not allow entry of their enemies. They find a way to communicate privately. There's a film made by a British director, and it's not a bad movie, but there's a part of it that irritates me, and it's called 12 Years a Slave. Well, there are a couple of things that bother me. One is I'm not interested in 12 years a slave, I'm interested in 85 years a slave. But this film is about a free black man living in the American North, living an idyllic life where he has charming relations with his white friends, and they sit around drinking coffee and eating biscuits together. And he's kidnapped and taken to a plantation in the South, you know, where they keep the plantations. And he's thrown in with enslaved people. And there's a flaw here in the story. He understands what they are saying to him, and he would not. He has not had the benefit of this enculturation, of this of the education within this context that these people have had. He would be as lost as a white person thrown in with these enslaved people. And so that bothered me because the film was cheating these characters, the enslaved characters, out of their humanity. And so that was in my head when I came to work on the novel, was that I didn't want, wanted the complexity of interaction between slaves. Education doesn't make us educated. The world makes us educated. And all the feelings that we imagine are not made anything different by our learning more about any particular subject. So the complicated relations and emotions of enslaved people would be there and present. That's what I wanted to represent.
You mentioned, as you were speaking, you mentioned this idea of the private, and it made me think of a moment where Huck has fallen asleep and Jim is really desperate to read. And it really struck me because you were speaking about this idea of Jim being for Jim reading being like a really private affair, and a moment in which he is completely free. And I wondered, there was that a moment for you to express Jim's interiority and also to kind of maintain these brief moments of privacy for enslaved people at that time?
Well, reading is the most subversive thing we can do, which is why fascist regimes rush to ban and burn books. No one, even if they're reading the same thing you're reading over your shoulder, can know what's going into you, know what you're processing, know what you're bringing to that text to create the meaning you need. Probably the next most subversive thing is writing, but reading is what makes the written word so important. I can write something and I can think I mean something, but it doesn't become anything until you read it. Words don't have propositional content. They don't float around in space doing anything. But when somebody reads it, they become thought and they become action. And that's a thrilling idea. I wouldn't even do this if I didn't have this in my mind. And I come to that as a reader, not as a writer.
On writing, as well as Jim's reading, there is this real desire for him to write, to find ways of expressing himself with words, with the etchings of a pencil. But this is something that he really wrangles with, both internally and externally as well. And I wondered, what was the importance for the desire for Jim to write, to actually express himself in that way?
Well, this is, the way you phrased that just made me think of something that I had not said before, and that is, Socrates was actually opposed to writing. Socrates thought that writing would negate thought, that if you started writing, you would stop thinking. I'm proof that that might be true. But as when your world has been stripped from you, when your history has been stripped from you, oral traditions fail. When you're taken from your culture into a place where you had never been, put with people with whom you did not come into this world, you don't have a history. And when you don't know where you will be, there is no one to impart that history to. So when Jim has the opportunity to write, he has the opportunity to leave his story and his world for someone else. And that is what writing does, the importance of history. I don't privilege written history over oral history, but oral history requires a continuity that was taken from the enslaved people.
I think also something that struck me with some of the moments where Jim is reading is this idea of him almost disappearing, of going to other worlds, of finding space to imagine, and in a way to strengthen his resolve, and also in a way to hope. And I wondered if that was an intention there, that reading opened up the world for Jim in a way that he at times doesn't quite feel prepared for, but is still leaning into.
See, this is why I talk to people like Caleb. I didn't have that thought, but now I'm going to say, yes, that's exactly what it is.
I think one of the first is actually on the first page of the novel. This idea of waiting, and it's something that appears throughout. And actually, I was so struck by the line you said, "Waiting to wait some more." That made me think. I don't think I've ever read Christina Sharp's work, but she talks about this idea of the weather and that being a symbol for slavery and the time after it. And it really made me think about how so often we're waiting for the weather to change, and I wondered what, for Jim, it's like he's not waiting. It feels like it's that something moves in him, and obviously there's a necessity. He's a fugitive for so long, but there is this sense of, especially towards the end of the novel, there is this sense of a real deepening of resolve, of a real going from things are happening to Jim is happening to the world. And I wondered, was that something that you intentionally found as you were writing, or was that something that just emerged?
Well, there's the interesting thing about outrage is it's not until it's felt that rage can exist. At least in the United States, outrage has a 10-day shelf life. Protests will spring up, people will become terribly upset about stuff for about 10 days. And then there's a football game, or there's something else in the news, and any consistent driving move toward a change is assumed by the air. In the novel, he has to create his outrage, and that is created by his understanding as he thinks through the world of what it means that he is property. And as he understands that, and as he understands where the fear of him is placed, what it means, well, he realizes that it's often you assume that, a scene I do remember, where he is sitting in a rowboat with Judge Thatcher. He has thoroughly kidnapped Judge Thatcher to take him someplace. And they're sitting in the boat, and Jim has a pistol trained on Thatcher. And he has given up speaking slave to Thatcher. He is speaking to Thatcher as he would to any other slave when he is not performing for his own safety. And Thatcher can't get over how he sounds. And he keeps asking, why are you talking like that? And Jim says, I'm sitting here with a pistol pointed at you, and you're concerned about my diction. And Jim learns that that's what Thatcher, as what he represents, is afraid of. He's afraid that Jim is equal to him. And that drives Jim forward with his own agency to commit some acts that earlier in the novel he wouldn't even have imagined.
As you were speaking, because one of the things I did want to ask you about was the place of anger in the novel and how, but Jim, I think at the beginning of the novel it's something that he is experiencing but can't quite name, and as the novel continues, his anger sort of escalates towards a real, not just like a real rage, and it begins to, I don't necessarily think it begins to cloud his judgment, but I think it begins to inform each of his moves. And I actually wondered, what is the place of anger for you, not just in this novel, but actually how we move through the world as well?
Well, again, controlled anger, understood anger, can move us to considered and appropriate action. Uncontrolled anger makes us rash. What I have with Jim is he uses his intelligence to control his anger, though it pushes him to some extreme measures. They are not. His actions are not performed without measure, without thought. I trained horses for a long time, and one of the things you learn immediately when you're dealing with a 1,200-pound animal that could kill you if it wanted to, it just doesn't know it can, is you never calm it down by becoming excited. And that's how I try to move through everything. But there are times when you have to express extreme action to convince the horse that this is a bad idea. And in this case, it was a mule that kicked out at my wife as she was walking by. And that's a really dangerous behavior. I didn't know why he did it. I just knew that he could never do it again. And it didn't make me mad, but he had to believe I was mad, and so I pitched a rage at him. I picked up a garbage bin and threw it down beside him. I scared him to death. It only worked because I decided to do it. If I had done it without thought and merely reacted, one, I might have hurt the animal, but two, I could not have controlled the situation and had the result I wanted. And that's the difference.
At one point in the novel, and as you were speaking, I was thinking this Jim, when he's talking to Huck, says speaking about white people, they take the lies that they want and throw away the truths that scare them. And I wondered, what's the role of truth and lies in the context of fiction for you, and actually specifically in this novel?
That's not for me. Well, first I can't answer it. I'm not smart enough to answer that, but that's for readers to figure out. I've done my part, and I don't write because I have anything to say. I write because I see the world and I want to render it. But if you're coming to my work for a message from me, you've already got some problems that I can't really help you with. can probably direct you to the right resource, but this is what art is. Art is it does what it does in the world. One of the exciting things about writing, about making any kind of art, is when you let it go, and you have to let it go out into the world, is you can't control it at all. And then I will hear things that, of course, I've never thought of, and that's thrilling. But the idea, and this comes back to my considerations of the language, that I can utter these phonemes, these syllables constructed in a string that we pre-ordered or make marks on a page, and you can come to it and find some kind of meaning, is remarkable. That is crazy. I love that. What's even more wonderful is that you can misunderstand what I've been trying to say completely and make up something that makes sense. That gives me a headache immediately. That is just too much.
There's a point halfway through the novel when Jim is battered and bruised, and it feels like his resolve is wavering. And he's speaking about this idea of starting to run again, but fearing that he might just be running in circles. At one point he asked, how do you run from lightning? And I wondered, for Jim, what is the cost of freedom?
Well, what Jim is also struggling with, what the novel is struggling with, is that existential question of when is anyone actually free? Will he be free if he's no longer considered property? He doesn't know. Is freedom a concept that we run to or that we run from? I look through windows as I'm driving through town, and I see people in their offices working, and I think in the morning what they say is, I have to go to work. Are they free? I have to go to work. And there are some people in the world who say, I get to go to work, but that they're weird. So it's that whole question of freedom is fascinating anyway. What a better question, and it's never articulated in the novel, a better question would be, when am I not encumbered by the pressures, desires, and needs of someone else?
I'm going to be thinking about that one for a while. One of the things that runs throughout the novel is this threat of death for the enslavement of black people. At one point Jim says, I haven't seen much killing myself, except that I live with it daily, the threat, the promise of it. And I wondered, what does it mean for Jim and actually for black people to live under this shadow of that threat constantly?
Well, it's sobering that you can go through day after day after day and not think about the threat. I don't know what color the police lights are here, but in the U.S. they're blue. And the experience of a black person seeing the blue lights in the rearview mirror of the car is a completely different experience from what white people feel. And that's a threat. I don't want it to be a threat. I want to get pissed off and not feel that way, but I have to feel that way. I have to tell my kids to feel that way. That's what Jen deals with every hour of every day. I don't have to deal with it until the blue light comes on, or I don't have to deal with it until I'm in the wrong place. We like to say that we've made a lot of progress, that race doesn't exist. People say, things are post-racial, and I point out to them, you just said post-racial. You use the word racial. How are we post-racial if you can use that word still? Is that when tell you a quick story, make this too long. My father and I were driving back from my mother's family home in South Carolina, and I must have been 9, and off in a field we saw a burning cross. And now that's the action of what's called the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist group that sprung up in the South of the United States in the 19th century after the Civil War, and persisted well into the 20th, and does exist now in very sad, pathetic little groups. But no less dangerous. At 9, we saw the burning cross, cars were slowing down, and there was a checkpoint. Cars were coming up, and ridiculous-looking white men with tall white hats were standing there looking into cars, and then they were passing on. And I was 9, and of course it was terrifying, but I didn't know the history of this. I didn't know exactly what was going on. My father, the gentlest person I have ever known, the nicest man I had ever known, suddenly in his lap, from someplace I did not see, he produced something I did not know was ever in the car, a pistol. He remained quiet, and when we came to the checkpoint, he stepped on the accelerator and we sped away. And luckily in our lives, we were not chased by any of these people. And then the pistol was gone. That was my lesson, is that my quiet, gentle father knew that there had to be a time, could be a time in his life when he was not going to be quiet and gentle. Because his child was like a mess. I'll leave it at that.
I think that's a good place to wrap up. Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll take some questions from the audience. I think there's a mic roving around. If you want to throw your hand up, we'll move around. We'll go in green at the front.
Hi. I know your inspiration for this book, but I just wanted to have a quick question about your process. After you read the original book 15 times, how do you then approach planning out, if you like, what the story you're going to tell?
Well, if I knew that, I'd be writing something new right now.
Do you have a process?
I do not. I make this up, and I wait a long time. I think about it a lot. I do not have a schedule. I don't like schedules. My wife likes to work for 4 hours in the morning. If anybody, I would kill myself if I had to work at a certain time. And if any of you ever came to me and said, hey, let's go to a movie, guess what I'd be doing? I'd go to a movie. I don't think I've ever in my life said, I have to work. No, it's obviously I do sometimes, but I feel like the laziest person in the world. It's going to happen. I just have to trust it.
I was really curious if you could talk a little bit about the power and fear dynamics in white passing, because Norman was a character that really struck me, because even as I was reading it, I was like, this is a white man. Like, why are you pretending to be black? And it was really frustrating for me. And I think part of that frustration came from knowing the power that you could have if you could pass and what that would be like in today's world, but also still reconciled with that fear of being found out.
Well, it's got to be terrifying. My grandfather, well, a number of people in my family look white. My grandfather, you wouldn't have known he was a black man, but he was a black man. He was married to a black woman. His brother left South Carolina and went to New Jersey, was never seen again, was because he was a white man. Now, perhaps in where he lived, he had no fear of being found out. And perhaps in the 20th century, people can make that choice. My wife, who is mixed race, looks white. She identifies as African American and moves through the world in that way. That's the choice she made as a child and continues to do that. But if you if you are discovered as black in a slavery or in the time of slavery, then you're in danger. You have tricked your oppressors, and you don't know what they will do. There's a great film, it's a great novel called Band of Angels by Robert Penn Warren. And there's a film of it with Sidney Poitier, Clark Gable, and Yvonne DiCarlo. Yvonne DiCarlo says to her slave-owning white father in the beginning, Father, why is Mother buried here next to us in the house and the rest of the family's on the hill? And the father says, well, I couldn't bear to have her so far from us. She goes off to school. She receives news that her father is dying. She hops into a carriage, and by the time she arrives back at the plantation, her father has died, and the funeral was in progress. And a man shows up to claim the chattel, of which she is a part. She has not known that she is black. She did not know that her mother was black. And she's been raised thinking she's white, but she is not. And she's taken off to New Orleans to be sold as a slave. So yes, there was a lot of danger in discovery, and there was a lot of danger in passing. But you can imagine, even then, we, with pride about who we are, can't imagine doing that. But if you were a slave, if you're imprisoned and it's your way out, that's not the same decision. So we have to be careful about our judgments about people who might decide to do that at different times in history with different pressures and different dangers.
This is a question for both of you. It's a question about storytelling and the importance or not that you think that storytelling has in this particular time. Here you are, both at very different points in your career. You're very much at the beginning. If I might say,
you can say Caleb's already called me old. It's all right.
So if you could say something about the place of storytelling, particularly in this cultural moment, if you could both speak to that.
I think for me, since I was young, storytelling has always been such a big part of my life. That idea, Percival, that you mentioned earlier, orality, was a big thing for me. I had a really large family growing up, and we were always telling stories between each other. And I was always so struck about the nature of the detail of these stories and how much they could wind and move around, but also the glimpses into the interior of people. And I think so much of what I'm trying to do as a storyteller is to give those senses, those glimpses, to find a way of showing how other people are thinking and feeling, but also how I am thinking and feeling, and in that way extending that towards you as a reader or as a receiver of those stories and asking you to do the same. And so for me that feels like of utmost importance.
What is that? That's how we understand the world, just through stories. When you open a stranger's refrigerator and you see what's in there, you construct a story. That is how we move through the world. We're always reading. When you see two people standing on the corner and they shake hands way too many times, you know it's a drug deal. You're reading all the time, and constructing stories. It's just what we do.
Percival, I was struck when you were talking about the timescale for outrage, because it put me in mind of the upsurge in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in 2020, which many, I think, participants and commentators would say was both the biggest and the most sustained movement, bigger even than the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. And obviously one of the huge demands of that was for our voices to be heard. I wonder whether or not we've influenced any of your work, including this novel, and whether there's a wider comment to be made about if there was any legacy from the Black Lives Matter movement that we should take today.
Well, the civil rights movement was a war, and that lasted a couple of decades and continues. As much as I was impressed by the protests after the killing of George Floyd, I was impressed by that it did last a little longer than 10 days, only a little longer than 10 days. But I was impressed by the demographic representation of the people who went out to protest. It was not just young black people, it was not just black people, it was lots of young people from different backgrounds and cultures, and came together, and that was really inspiring. Black Lives Matter is a wonderful movement. It's not new. It's a new way of saying the same thing. No less important for saying the same thing, but it's not new. And that's the kind of the thing that problem that drives our culture is everyone's looking for that new thing, something else to be a star, instead of plodding along in the right direction without stopping. Again, I don't, to listen to me about my beliefs about the world is not a clever thing to do. I would avoid it, but and I come from the United States of America. My country has never failed to let me down. In that way, it has succeeded beautifully. And if I had any idea of how to affect the direction of it, I would be shouting it from every place. My belief is that art makes us better. It's a 19th century thought, really, coming into the 20th century thinking that the art of a place, of a nation, of a world, is how we better ourselves. Walt Whitman, in a poem called By Blue Ontario Shore, says, and I'm paraphrasing, but since it's Walt Whitman, that doesn't matter. Says, if you want a better society, produce better people. And that's what art can do, but it's also the case that we have to educate our people.
Hello, wonderful, both of you. Can I ask, have you always wanted to be writers, storytellers? Is that what you wanted to do when you were, question for both of you, when you were younger? Please.
But you're closer to being younger.
Yeah, I think for me it's something that both writing and storytelling is something that I've always really gravitated towards. There was just like this sense of connection being forged in both externally and also internally. It gave me a space to understand what I was thinking and feeling better, and then find ways of communicating and expressing that. So I think it is something I've always gone towards.
I came to being a writer late. I was always a reader, and it never occurred to me that I could write. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. I studied mathematical logic as a undergraduate in college, because there's so much need in the world for mathematical logic, and went on to study philosophy of language. And it was when I was studying philosophy of language that I realized I really hated philosophy. And I was too young to be doing it. I was bored by it. But what I was doing was writing scenes. And since I was writing scenes, I had been a reader. I started writing fiction. And that's how I ended up a writer. It was a sort of an intellectual misturn.
I think we've got time for one more.
We're privileging the people in the front.
Yeah, we are. That's Did you want a wrap like you started?
Hi. Yeah, a few years ago I reread Huckleberry Finn for the first time as an adult, and so my question coming in was about that sort of what you get out of revisiting something in a different context. But your mention of reading it 15 times also made me think about the effect of repetition on going through almost like a chant, almost a long chant. And I was just wondering in either of those ways how that experience, if it produced any strange thoughts or revelations about Mark Twain or the South or anything that you hadn't expected out of the process.
There's plenty of strange dreams. No, not really. I don't think I had any revelations about Twain. Again, by about the fourth time, I was so sick of it that it was every other time it was a chore. It was like doing push-ups. Well, yeah, I can probably do 5 push-ups. But when I get to 50, it's really hard, and it's a struggle, and each next one means something different and gets me a little bit closer to death. So, and that's how it feels reading something that many times. I can't stand the idea of reading it now. However, I know that world very well, and in that way the exercise is useful.
I'm afraid that's it. Can we please thank Caleb for his questions?